WNOV family, this is Will Martin, and you're listening to The Difference. And Jermaine, you drive.
Yes, sir.
You drive Fond du Lac Avenue, don't you? Okay. You've been through the overpass on Fond du Lac, just
Yeah.
underneath I-40, I-94, right?
Yeah.
And you see that mural,
Mm-hmm.
right? I mean, I wonder how many of us drive past that mural on a regular basis
Yeah.
and either don't know what the mural is of,
Yeah.
or why, what the story is behind. It's the mural of Joshua Glover,
Yeah.
and so I wanted to kick off the first show, at least my first show of Black History Month, having a conversation about Joshua Glover.
Nice. Awesome.
And our guest today is Michael Jahr, who is actually a filmmaker, documentarian. And so there you go, you round of applause, right? And so, getting you here and making sure that you get a chance to talk about something that's become a real passion for you. And I've gotten a chance to see some of your work. So welcome, Michael Jahr, to WNOV.
Thank you, Will. Delighted to be here. This is a great story, and I'm excited to be able to share it.
Yeah. So let's start off, with the very first question. Who is Joshua Glover?
Yeah, it's a question that we shouldn't. It's sad that we have to ask it. People in Milwaukee, people in Racine, should know that name, and it's just been kind of lost to history. And so that's part of the reason that we decided we need to tell this story. So Joshua Glover was a fugitive slave. He had been enslaved in St. Louis, Missouri. In 1852, he said, "I'm not doing this anymore," and just took the courageous move of, basically escaping from his owner, from the farm, and walking in an unknown area to him, 400 miles to Racine, Wisconsin.
Yeah.
So he gets to Racine. He's welcomed there by the abolitionist community.
Wait. I don't want to stop you though. Because we just say 400 miles like we're driving 400 miles.
Seriously.
The idea of actually walking and not knowing who you're going to encounter along the way.
Exactly.
I mean, as an escaped slave, and I know we're going to get to the Fugitive Slave Act, that, hey, you leave, they have, under the law at that time, you could go back and retrieve the person and bring him back.
Exactly, by law.
So the idea that you would go 400 miles knowing no one.
Right.
And not knowing where you're going.
Yeah, I can't imagine it. It's so hard for us to imagine, I think, in this modern era, traveling, 400 miles and actually getting to your destination with no interstate highways,
no GPS,
no maps, and even worse, as a slave, as an escaped slave, you can't be seen.
Right.
So you've got to travel at night. You've got to stick to the woods or dark places or river beds and whatever. And then you have the knowledge that somebody is probably on your heels trying to track you down. And that was the case with Joshua Glover.
Right. So he actually ends up coming to Racine.
Racine, was a well-known abolitionist community. And he gets there and he finds a job at a sawmill. He seemed to be a pretty skilled laborer, good woodworker. And he finds a place to live. And for 2 years, he finally enjoys the benefits of freedom.
Wow.
The liberty he probably had dreamed about his whole life.
Earning a wage as opposed to having his labor stolen from him.
Exactly. Yeah. Can you imagine?
Yeah, man. So it's incredible.
So the problem was that his former master, a guy named Benamy Garland, never stopped looking for him. So he put a $200 bounty on Joshua Glover's head and put that in the newspapers. He hired slave catchers to try to track him down. And after 2 years, they did. Wow. So in March of 1854, Benamy Garland comes to Milwaukee, goes to the courthouse, and says, I need a warrant because I need to reclaim my property. Which is a horrible concept.
Mm-hmm.
He then puts together a posse, which includes 2 federal U.S. deputy marshals, and they go down to Racine, to Glover's house, and they go at night because they don't have the courage to do it during the day.
Mm-hmm.
They go at night, they knock on the door. Glover's playing cards with a couple of friends.
Yeah. Now, let me stop you here before we get into it. What year are we talking about? When is this all happening?
This is March of 1854.
Okay.
So it's wintry, Wisconsin weather in March. It's crappy weather, cold, and it's actually March 10th, and they show up at his house March 10th, the evening of March 10th, and
which is not much
knock on
later
the
than
door.
this.
Right.
It's cold. It's damp.
It is snow on the
Um,
ground. Everything's frozen.
Yeah. And this is also 1850s when we're still arguing state by state about slave and free,
Yes.
and how we're going to actually work this out about any additional states coming in. So
Right.
there's a huge debate going on this whole time about any state coming in has to be paired with another state free or enslaved.
Yeah. It's in the center of this massive national debate over the Fugitive Slave Act. The Kansas-Nebraska Act is coming up in 1854. It's being considered in Congress, which would basically say, in the previous federal arrangement, basically the compromise of the Missouri Compromise of 1820, you could not have slavery above a certain line, the Mason-Dixon line. So slavery was kept in the South. It was not expanding into the North or the West. Under the Kansas-Nebraska Act, that was going to change. And it was going to be that every state could determine whether or not it wanted to be a free state or a slave state. And that sounds like a good concept. It sounds democratic. We'll just let them vote and let them choose. But for the people of the North, that meant slavery could then begin to move into northern states, and they thought that was a horrible
And of course,
idea.
for the people in the South, African Americans were still enslaved at that time.
Exactly. 4 million, close to 4 million people
Yeah.
were still in bondage at that time.
Right.
So,
So you're talking about at the very same time that he individually ends up coming to Wisconsin and settles here is the very same time when we're at the heat of this argument about expanding slavery in the country.
exactly. The 1850s were a very volatile time in this nation. So we had the Fugitive Slave Act that was passed in 1850. Kansas-Nebraska Act was considered in 1854. There was fighting in Kansas as people moved in, trying to make it a slave state or a free state. There were conflict. There were murder.
Bloody Kansas.
Bleeding Kansas. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. That's when Uncle Tom's Cabin was published, which became a bestseller and really made a lot of people in the North aware of the horrors of slavery. We had John Brown's Raid in Harper's Ferry, where he tried to basically raise an insurrection, a slave insurrection, and overthrow the Southern plantation owners.
And there are a lot of these newspapers, as I know it came up
Yeah.
in a previous discussion, a lot of these newspapers that were popping up that were about freedom, were about abolitionist newspapers that were popping up all over the North.
Exactly. There really was a growing movement in the North where they had newspapers and they had organizations and they had the Underground Railroad and all sorts of things that were where people were actively involved in saying we want to put a stop to the expansion of slavery and for many people abolish it entirely. So the Milwaukee actually had I think more than one abolitionist newspaper, and Waukesha had an abolitionist newspaper. It's still there. It's called the Waukesha Freeman, and it was called the Freeman because it was dedicated to the freedom of slaves.
Yeah.
And
I know we're going to get to, I know Sherman Booth was one of those people who was also out promoting abolition as well.
Yeah, he had an abolitionist newspaper in Milwaukee at the
Mhm.
time. And so Joshua Glover, so this posse goes down.
Yeah.
Benemy Garland goes down with this posse. They knock on the door, and somebody opens the door. This posse rushes in, and Joshua Glover obviously is shocked by this. Somebody invading his home, and so he tries to defend himself. He tries to protect himself. Well, that gets him a beating, and they literally they beat him. He falls to the ground. He's bloodied, bleeding from the head. They shackle him. They take him outside and they put him in a wagon that they've rented, and they put him on the floor of this wagon with just like a robe around him. So it's freezing cold night. He's not wearing a coat or anything.
Yeah.
And then he has to travel several hours on these terrible, cold, frozen roads because again, nothing was paved back then, from Racine all the way back up to Milwaukee. So they arrive in Milwaukee at the jail about 3:00 in the morning.
Wow.
They throw him in a cell. They do no treatment. He's still bleeding from his head. And he's destined to return to St. Louis and a lifetime of bondage. You can imagine how horrifying that would be after 2 years of freedom.
Absolutely.
But the word gets out that one of the guys that he was playing cards with literally crawled out the window and escaped from this posse and alerted people in the Racine area, the abolitionist community, that Joshua Glover had been arrested. So they organized a huge rally the following day. It was apparently the largest gathering in the city of Racine that had ever taken place.
Wow.
And they also sent a telegram up to Sherman Booth, who you mentioned, this abolitionist newspaper editor in Milwaukee. And so Sherman Booth goes to the courthouse to determine whether or not this has actually taken place. The judge and others initially deny it, but then he finally determines that yes.
They deny it?
They actually deny. They say no. There's been no. They you know how politicians are. They find a way to kind of weasel around it. So I think he came in and said, "Hey, I hear that a man has been kidnapped and has been brought to the jail." And they're like, "Oh no, no one's been kidnapped." So they kind of dodge. And so he's like thinking, well, maybe this actually didn't take place. But then he runs into somebody who says, yes, absolutely, he's in that cell right there.
Yeah.
And so Sherman Booth gets on a horse and rides around the streets of Milwaukee, like Paul Revere, yelling and calling out for his neighbors to come out to the courthouse to, basically because a man's liberty is at stake. And he wants people to rally around this man and call for due process and basically get him released. So after he gets back to the courthouse about 2:00 in the afternoon, about 5,000 people have gathered in the courthouse square.
Okay, now the thing is, I'm always fascinated about where these things happened, and so, I think a lot of people don't know that the Milwaukee courthouse and the jail were up at Cathedral Square. So when you go up there, it looks to me like it's the opposite side, Elsa's. It looks like where Elsa's is at, right on that side of the square, as opposed to where St. John's Cathedral is on the other side.
Yeah, I don't even know exactly how it was situated. I think it took up the better part of that square.
Okay.
Because the courthouse is a pretty good size, but I think you're right. I think it was more to that side.
Mm-hmm.
And the courthouse and the jail were connected. It was basically one building,
one long building. It looks like.
Yeah, and so about 5,000 people gathered outside. Again, I mean, no telephones, no way to spread the word except just by word of mouth. And on a cold day in March, everybody dropped what they were doing to turn out on behalf of this man who was, they felt was wrongly incarcerated.
So now you have two communities worth of people who were incensed about this federal law and this ridiculous situation of being able to take people as property and to reclaim them.
Wisconsin is a free state. So the people of Wisconsin are saying, wait, how can we take somebody who is in our under our Constitution, is here as a free citizen of the state of Wisconsin.
And our Constitution says that every person here is free.
Explicitly, right, from 1848, from the very beginning. So how can this man, how can we, in this community be involved in any way in returning him to slavery? And so
Wisconsin isn't even 10 years old.
No. Right.
When this happens. I mean, we have just basically become a state, 1848, and here we are in the earlier 1850s. So the idea that, just right out of the gate, we're actually saying, no, we mean it.
Right.
Everybody in this state is free. So they gather, and I know that you've mentioned about they're waiting for the due process.
Right. So, and it's interesting too, actually in Racine, about 100 people from that crowd get on a boat in Racine, because it's probably actually faster to go up the lake than to take the old nasty roads back in those days. So 100 people get on a boat and come up to Milwaukee to join the protest up here, including the sheriff.
Wow.
And the sheriff had actually, there were two wagons that were at the arrest of Joshua Glover. One wagon came up with the owner and one of the deputy marshals to the jail. The other wagon was returned because it had been rented. The sheriff encountered the deputy marshal and his assistant who were returning the other wagon, and he arrested them on suspicion of kidnapping and assault.
Okay, so wait a minute now. The people who went and arrested Joshua Glover, the folks that went down there as part of the posse to go get him, those people who were arresting him are now arrested by the Racine sheriff.
Exactly, and a federal warranted officer who's carrying out federal law was arrested by the local sheriff for kidnapping and for assault. And it just shows you the difference in mindset, of those who said, well, we have to do this because the federal law says we have to do it, versus those who said, no, this is my neighbor.
Right.
And we're not going to be involved in returning him to slavery. And you're certainly not going to do it without, you could just go and snatch anybody. And so there has to be at least some due process that this man is given.
Right.
And under the Fugitive Slave Act, that was not going to be forthcoming.
Wow. So they took it upon themselves to decide they're not returning him.
Exactly. So the 5,000 people are gathered outside the courthouse, and they set it up actually very much like a meeting. So they elected a president, they appointed committees, they gave speeches, they filed a bunch of resolutions requiring due process.
These people are outdoors, right?
Yeah.
outdoors you've already said it's not great weather in Wisconsin
Right.
in March. It's cold.
They're out there for
it's
hours.
damp.
Yeah.
You've got mud.
Yeah.
And people are standing out there and they're actually holding a meeting and electing people to representatives for this conversation.
Absolutely. And following, the regular order as if they were having a city council meeting. It was that organized. And actually, it's really interesting. The man who was elected the president of the gathering was actually one of the founding members of Northwest Mutual. So there's some really cool Milwaukee ties to all of this. And he was so well respected that he was elected president and then kind of oversaw the following events.
Wow.
But after a while, it became clear that the officials were not going to be releasing Joshua Glover. So the cathedral at Cathedral Square was being built at the time. And there was a beam that was a wooden beam that was part of the construction site. So a group of men went over and grabbed that wooden beam and said, well, this will be a good enough key to allow us to open the door of the courthouse.
Okay.
And they used that beam to batter down the door of the courthouse. They rushed in. They overwhelmed the guards. They basically pried open the jail cell.
I know I keep stopping you, man, but
No,
look,
it's
it's so crazy a story, right?
Yeah.
I mean, to think that this is actually happening. So people show up, they spend their whole day outside. They get to the point where, hey, justice is not justice here, right? So they literally go get a beam,
a battering ram,
and they take it and they bash the place in. They actually break into the jail.
They break into the federal courthouse
and actually go in there and go get them
and grab them out. Yep.
I mean, that just doesn't happen.
No, when you think about a lot of American history, quite often if there's a mob of angry people outside of a jail cell and a black man is inside it, the outcome is not good.
Right.
And we do know those stories, and we should know those stories. What we don't
America's
know,
Black Holocaust Museum's here because of those stories.
Yeah, exactly. And but there were stories that were similar to this, where there were mobs that gathered outside to make sure that a black man did not get returned to slavery. And that happened in Boston and in Philadelphia and New York City. And it happened here in Milwaukee, in the north. Yeah.
Okay. So they literally go in and they go get him.
They grab him. And poor guy is still bleeding. He's probably overwhelmed by this mob that rushes in for the second time in 2 days. He's been assaulted by a mob in essence. But this mob is, on his side. So they bring him out, they whisk him out of the jail, and there's a carriage that's waiting there. They put him on the carriage. The crowd just goes crazy. They just treat him like a conquering hero. And everybody wants to shake his hand and everybody's cheering. But they also got to get him out of there because the feds are obviously not going to sit by and let this happen.
So they bring him up in the darkness of night because they know it's wrong.
Right. They know it's wrong, and they know there's a strong abolitionist community in this area.
And here these abolitionists break him out of jail, and he then proudly is celebrated leaving in the daytime.
Exactly. In broad daylight.
Okay.
Yeah. So they take him down to Walker's Point. He switches to another carriage at that point, and he's taken to Prairieville, which is now Waukesha.
Okay.
And that was really at the time kind of in the deep woods.
Interesting. I didn't know that he'd actually gone west.
Yeah. That's initially where they took him.
Okay.
And then they kind of, over the next several weeks, they hid him in different homes and barns and attics, kind of keeping him on the move at different places.
More of the Underground Railroad concept.
The Underground Railroad was very active here in southeast Wisconsin, so he was in different communities. There is a story about some of the federal law enforcement actually maybe having tracked him down at the house where he was staying.
Okay.
And the owner of that house coming out to the fence where these gentlemen were arriving with his gun and basically saying, hey, you have no right to be here and you need to move along. And there was a standoff for a while.
Wow.
And eventually the federal authorities left. So
can you just imagine today to be able to tell the feds,
yeah,
oh, no, you don't have any right to come anywhere near my house. You need to move along.
Move along. Yep. You have no right to be here.
And you've got your gun out.
Right.
Like, I'm protecting my property.
Exactly.
And they just leave.
And knowing that he was under federal law, completely in the wrong. You mean that in the sense that he could have been arrested, he could have been jailed, he could have been shot.
But under Wisconsin and under moral law, he was right.
He was taking a stand.
And he stood his ground.
Exactly.
That's it's amazing story. So, all right. So he ends up in Waukesha. They move him around. How's all this movement around end?
So we don't even know exactly how long because nobody's keeping records of these things because everything they were doing was illegal. But we think about 3 to 4 weeks he was hidden. And then there's a ship captain in Racine who had a reputation for smuggling fugitive slaves out of, kind of out of the Underground Railroad and into Canada. So they connect with him. He agrees to take Joshua Glover in one of his seagoing ships through Lake Michigan, and takes him around to Ontario. And Joshua Glover ends up there and is then welcomed into a community just outside of Toronto. It's actually now a part of Toronto as the city has expanded, but he was in a small burg outside of Toronto at the time. Again, found employment and was there he was married. And he was
now,
probably
was he
there.
married here, or did he get married up there?
Not to our knowledge. We
Okay.
can't find any record of his being married, but we haven't exhausted everything. We
Yeah.
believe that he was purchased by Ben-Ami Garland on the courthouse steps of St. Louis on January 1st, 1850.
Wow.
So he had been with him for about 2 years.
Okay.
But can you imagine, again, Happy New Year, we're selling you into slavery, or
Right.
we're selling you to a new owner. We believe that he originally had come from Virginia.
Okay.
But we haven't been able to track down if he had any other
Wow.
family prior to that.
Okay. Well, we're going to continue this conversation with the difference right after this break. Family, we are back. You're listening to The Difference, and my guest is Michael Jahr, who is a filmmaker, director, and producer. He's already produced a mini documentary on Joshua Glover, and I think you can hear that he has got the details down and has done the research. And I want to come back to later in the conversation the fact that you're working on creating a full-length documentary about Joshua Glover. But let's keep with the story about, when we were talking about the fact that you had a ship captain who was ready to get him up to Toronto.
Yeah, he had some method for smuggling fugitive slaves, out that I guess avoided any inspectors who might pop in, because obviously the feds were still looking for Joshua Glover, and they
Right.
would probably be watching the ports pretty closely. But they managed to get him on this ship, took him to Canada, and he lived out the rest. He lived to be about 80 or 81, as
Wow.
far as we can tell.
And do we
And
know
just
how
died
old
of
he
old age.
was?
He was. They didn't keep good, records of births and so on.
Yeah.
But we think he was probably in his late 30s
When
at
he
the
was
time
here.
of all this happened. Yeah.
Okay, so
Yeah.
so he lived another 50 years.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Wow,
So
okay.
40, 50 years we think that
Oh
he
my
lived
goodness.
in
All right.
and in Toronto there actually is a park dedicated. It's Joshua Glover Park, and there's a monument statue or a bust of him
Okay.
in that park commemorating his life. So
Oh, that's amazing.
it's cool.
And for those in the audience who maybe are not aware, there's actually a plaque in Cathedral Square
Mhm.
that actually addresses the Joshua Glover story there as well, in
Yeah.
addition to the mural.
There's a historical marker there that just very briefly touches on what took place there on March 10th and March 11th, 1854. I
Wow.
wish there was more.
Yeah.
It really deserves to have more. There's also a plaque that has kind of a copper carving of the courthouse itself, so you can kind of get a sense of
Okay.
what the courthouse looked like at the time.
Wow. So but as you're right that there should be more in place, but you're doing more. I mean, you've already put together a mini documentary
Mhm.
on this. Is I think 12 minutes long.
12 minutes, yeah. We released that in July. We showed it at the Miller Theater, is where it premiered, and now we're working on a full-length documentary. It's called Liberty at Stake, because as Sherman Booth, the newspaper editor, rode his horse around town, he was calling out, "A man's liberty is at stake."
Yeah.
But the story didn't end with Joshua Glover, and so we call it Liberty at Stake because 4 million other Americans also, their liberty was also at stake in the context of this political and cultural environment in which slavery was still taking place in the South,
Yeah.
but was at a kind of a crucial intersection as to whether or not we were going to go forward with slavery, without slavery, or ripping apart as a nation.
Right. Right.
So 9 days after Joshua Glover was rescued, even before he got onto the ship to Canada, a group of people gathered up in Ripon, Wisconsin. So we started off in Racine, we moved to Milwaukee, now we're
Yeah.
up in Ripon, Wisconsin.
Yeah.
And about 50 people gathered in a little white schoolhouse in Ripon and said they were Whigs and Democrats and Free Soil Party
These
members.
are all political parties of the day, right?
Exactly.
That are long gone.
And the Whig Party was kind of a failing party. The Democrat Party was, a lot of people felt, too beholden to the slave owners, the slaveocracy, as
A
it was
lot
called.
of the Democrats would have been down in the South.
Yes, exactly. And even the Northern Democrats quite often did
Were
the bidding
sympathetic.
or were sympathetic to what was, their Southern partners. The Whig Party in the previous election just was losing ground. They didn't have much of a future. There was a Free Soil Party, there was a Liberty Party, but they were very small and ineffectual.
Yeah.
So these people gathered in this little white schoolhouse and said, we need a new political party in this country based primarily on anti-slavery. They didn't agree on much else.
Yeah.
They disagreed on economic issues and other things. They had different backgrounds. They even disagreed about whether or not we should allow people to drink, because you had sort of the New Englanders who were for the temperance movement and the Germans who were like, over my dead body. So
Wow.
there wasn't much.
Right. And there's a lot of Germans that settled in Wisconsin.
Right,
So.
exactly. So there wasn't much that unified them, except for the fact that they said, we cannot allow this country, this nation, to continue half free and half slave. This needs to come to, and we're certainly not going to let it expand into the North and the West. So,
And this is 9 days
9 days
after they rescue
yeah,
Joshua Glover.
March 11th he was rescued, and March 20th this gathering takes place in Ripon.
Wow.
So these people come out and they start calling themselves Republicans, and they say we want to move this party forward. And so they very quickly arranged for a convention, which took place in July in Madison. If you can imagine that, one of the founding gatherings that formed the Republican Party actually took place in Madison, Wisconsin.
Probably not today.
And another one took place in Jackson, Michigan,
Okay.
in July as well. And they really began to kind of put form on this concept of a new anti-slavery Republican
So
Party.
now it gets beyond Wisconsin.
Yeah, right.
So,
Very quickly.
Wisconsin helps to actually create the Republican Party, which is based on abolition. based
Yeah.
on ending slavery.
Exactly. And they were that really Jackson, Michigan sometimes claims that they were the first because they had this big convention, but it was months later. This was the
Yeah.
first group of people that came together and said, we're going to call ourselves Republicans.
And by
we're
this
gonna,
time, they've already had 2 meetings, both the initial and then they have their own convention in
yeah,
Madison.
I think the one in Madison and the one in Jacksonville were very close to each other in July of
Okay.
1854. So,
Wow. So all this is happening in 1854. Of course, we're getting closer to 1860 when
Yeah.
things are going to break.
Right, exactly. So very quickly in the next election, we did have a Republican. The first Republican governor was elected in Wisconsin. Governor Randall.
Mhm.
Camp Randall Stadium is
Yeah.
named after him because he was very involved. Camp Randall was actually a stationing point for soldiers, Wisconsin soldiers, who were going to be trained and then go off to fight the Civil War. And we had very quickly a number of Republican legislators and Republican members of Congress that were elected in Wisconsin. And then the first Republican candidate who was elected as president was Abraham Lincoln just a
Right.
few years later. So
Just one state down.
yeah, right, exactly.
So talk to us. I think we often don't realize the enormous connection back to Joshua Glover ends up becoming the spark
Yeah,
for all these other things to start happening.
yeah. He was a catalyst. It really was. You have to imagine that this didn't just happen in sort of a vacuum. This got a lot of national media attention.
Talk about
And
this.
yeah, so
You
if you think about the South, the reason that they passed the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850 was not because there wasn't a way to already return fugitive slaves. The Constitution actually had that provision, although the word slavery is never mentioned, but
Mhm.
they had provisions that would allow for that. The problem from the Southern perspective was that the northern states were doing everything they could to undermine that. So they were creating all sorts of laws that would give all sorts of rights to anybody who was accused of being a slave,
Yeah.
making it very, very hard for them to be returned.
So if you could get to a free state,
Yeah,
you might stay free.
exactly. And there was the Underground Railroad, and there were all sorts of activities to make sure that fugitive slaves did not get returned. From the Southern slave owners' perspective, this was the theft of their property. This was immoral. This was a horrible thing. Here we are, our property wanders off. And again, it's not like we're talking about cattle or horses, but that's
Right.
how they perceived it. It's horrible. But, it should be returned to us because we bought it and paid for it and we own it.
Yeah.
And when people in the North didn't do that, they saw that as it was an affront to the Southerners. This is our economic way of life. This is legal. And you have every responsibility to return our property to us. While the people of the North put up every wall and block and hindrance and
Mhm.
obstacle that they could. And so the Fugitive Slave Act was passed in 1850 to put more teeth into it. So there were very extensive penalties, fines, you jail time if you didn't cooperate. And that
Right.
didn't just apply to federal authorities. It applied to local authorities, and it applied to people like you and me.
Yeah.
So if you were just a Wisconsinite and you were hiding somebody, or you were even aware that somebody was being hidden, you were in violation of federal law and could pay, I think it was $1,000 fine, which back then would have been a huge amount of money.
Yeah.
You probably made a couple $100 a year as a worker. So $1,000 fine would be just ruinous. And so in that context is, now all of a sudden you read in the newspaper in the South that this community up in Wisconsin not only didn't help return the slave, they broke in. They raided him.
Yeah.
And they hit him until he was disappeared, basically.
So this one story about this one person ends up becoming national news.
And it just kind of continues to rip that fabric between North and South. And then 9 days later, you get this new party that's basically formed, and it says, we exist for one reason, to end slavery. And again, if you're in the South and you're reading about this, they're seeing this as their economic structure.
Their way of
this
life.
is our way of life. And here's this new party in the North that's literally just opposed to the way we do things down here. So you can see how the continuing chasm is
Yeah.
growing between North and South as a result of these things taking place in March of 1854 in Wisconsin. It's
Yeah.
really amazing.
Wow. So, okay, I have to ask you, why would a white man who's worked in, just tick through, well, here, let me get to the question. And then I think I'd love for you to go through, your background, because you've been involved in a number of, think tanks and political situations,
Mhm.
etc. What makes a white man decide this is a story that needs to be told and I need to tell it?
Yeah, good question. And it's funny, I've actually had some introductions to people like via email and so on. Where a friend will introduce me to someone else, and we'll meet at a coffee shop, and they'll come in expecting to meet a black man,
Yeah.
and be surprised that I'm not. Well, first of all, it's just a compelling story. So I have been in communications and journalism my whole career, and so whenever I find a good story, I want to tell that story. So my background is I've worked at public policy think tanks, and public policy can be pretty dry. So you really have to, if you want to kind of move the needle on public opinion, you've got to find stories that do that. So if you're talking about, we need licensing reform, people's eyes glaze over, whatever.
Right.
It doesn't affect me. But if you talk about a guy who's a barber up in Green Bay, and he's cutting the hair of a number of the Green Bay Packers, and they close his business down because he doesn't have some goofy license, even though he's been cutting hair and he's legally licensed himself, then suddenly people go, that's horrible. And they can relate to that, and they can see the need for reform. So I've been involved in that kind of storytelling over the years. I worked for the Current Family Foundation, which is one of the biggest foundations, not only in Wisconsin, but in the country. And before that, I worked on Capitol Hill for 10 years, lived on Capitol Hill, lived in the very urban core. And I started off as a journalist. I worked in Flint, Michigan, and Ann Arbor, Michigan.
Oh my goodness!
I'm a Flint native. So,
oh wow! All right, man.
I went to school. This is cool.
So you've seen adversity then, if
absolutely.
if you come from Flint.
Yeah. I went to high school with Terry Crews.
Okay.
He was two years behind me, and a couple of the members of Ready for the World. If you're old enough to remember Ready for the World, Sheila.
Oh yeah.
A couple of those guys were in my my high school class.
Okay.
So yeah, anyway, I've just always had a passion for finding good stories, telling good stories. And when I found this story, I kind of looked around to see, okay, where is there more information about this? There has to be, some videos out there, or a documentary or something. I was shocked at how little there was out there.
Wow.
And so I always had it kind of in the back of my mind that we should tell this story at some point, but wasn't actively pursuing it. It wasn't until I was at an estate sale.
Yeah.
And I ran across a book called The Rescue of Joshua Glover, A Fugitive Slave, the Constitution, and the Coming of the Civil War. And I picked that up, and I began to read it, and I realized, oh my gosh, there's a lot more to this story than just a good story about a man being rescued.
Yeah.
The impact that this had in terms of kind of a domino in a string of other events that would eventually lead to the Civil War was remarkable. And I had never known those aspects of the story. And that's when I decided, we need to really tell this story. It's got relevance today, and we just don't hear stories like this. So I just felt very compelled to do it. And so we've gotten some great folks that we've worked with. Claiborne Benson at the Milwaukee County Black History Society and Museum. Mayor Chevy Johnson.
Cavalier Johnson as
Cavalier's
well.
been very involved.
Yeah.
And we just started to pull some people together and say, hey, how can you help us tell this story? We set it up as a nonprofit so that we can raise money and
because this isn't free. I mean, nobody can actually put together a documentary for free.
Exactly.
But,
you've got all sorts of, everything from, got to have lawyers and accountants, and you got to have music rights, and you've got to pull together the film crew.
You hear that, Jermaine? You even have to have the music rights. So
got to have the music rights. Seriously.
As a musician, he approves.
Yes, that's right. Don't just go ripping that off. So we are, in the process of taking that 12-minute mini documentary and turning it into a full-length documentary. And one aspect of it too that's interesting is the rescuers themselves, Sherman Booth and a few of the other rescuers, were actually arrested under the Fugitive Slave Act. They were arrested for their role in rescuing Joshua Glover.
I think it's incredible because it's not like there were no consequences.
No,
they took that beam. They were able to smash through and actually go get him out of jail. But it wasn't like people didn't know who went and got him out of jail.
Exactly. It was very public. Again, thousands of witnesses were there. It was at the courthouse. So judges and law enforcement officials were all there. They all saw it happen.
Yeah.
So it wasn't like they could, hope to sneak under the radar and slip away.
So these people didn't just go home and forget about it.
Right.
They had to pay the consequence of actually breaking this former slave out.
They knew that was a risk. Yeah. So they were thrown in jail. They faced criminal charges. They faced a civil suit. Ben Garland, the owner, actually sued them in court for the loss of his, property. And they lost, like the Sherman Booth lost his newspaper business. He had to sell off his equipment in order to pay that. And this went on for 6 years, in and out of the courts. So the federal
Wow.
courts, this is oversimplifying it a bit, but basically the federal courts would say they were wrong to have done this and would throw them in jail. The state courts would say, well, there are extenuating circumstances, and we're going to give them at least a writ of habeas corpus, which means that they can be released until the next stage of the trial.
Okay.
So they were kind of in and out of jail over the
Okay.
course of several years. Ultimately, though, and this is, I think, one of the best parts of the story, the Supreme Court here in Wisconsin ruled that the Fugitive Slave Act was unconstitutional and would not be enforced in the Badger State.
So this is the crazy part. In addition, I mean, just to talk about how radically different those times were. A state Supreme Court cannot overrule the U.S. Supreme Court.
We can't
It
even imagine that today.
overrule the federal government. It can't overrule Congress. It can't overrule the president. They overruled everybody
They did.
to just decide, like, yeah, this thing you did in D.C.,
Yeah.
we're not doing it.
Yeah, we're not a part of
It's
that.
not going to work here.
And it was, and they made a compelling argument. It wasn't, they didn't do it lightly. They basically said, look, if there's any meaning to a free state, then forcing us to participate in slavery undermines the very definition of a free state.
Right.
And so if our Constitution says that we are a free state, we are going to abide by our Constitution no matter what. And the interesting thing was that the court at the time, the Supreme Court in the United States Supreme Court,
Yeah.
was the Taney Court, which is also the court that
Oh,
put
yeah.
down the infamous Dred Scott
Dred
decision.
Scott decision, yeah.
So they already did
Also
not
in
have
St. Louis.
yeah, exactly. Another St. Louis ties, and he had actually spent some time in Wisconsin as well. Dred Scott had.
Okay.
So it really, again, all these things are sort of intersecting at the same time.
Wow.
But yeah, the Supreme Court said, no, we're not going to be enforcing that law
And
here
this
in
is
Wisconsin.
just 6 years after we became a state.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
this is just 6 years.
Yeah,
And
brand
we're
new
telling the
state,
feds what we're not going to do.
take a hike.
There we go. I mean, it's an incredible story about, and today we couldn't get away with it, but
Right.
the notion that here we could actually say, no, that federal law does not apply to us. We're not doing it in Wisconsin.
Exactly. And just one more straw on the camel's back, again, between North-South relations. Again, the South just saw this as a horrible, like a punch to the gut of the Southern laws, the Southern rules,
Right.
the Southern mindset, the Southern
Well, I'm sure
economy.
they're thinking that if we can get away with it as a brand new state,
Right.
then presumably everybody else can get away with deciding,
Exactly.
like,
We're going
and
to see
that
this
whole
happen in
concept of,
Michigan and
like,
Ohio.
nullification.
Right.
So this idea that, and it had happened, come up before, all the way back to Andrew Jackson being in,
Exactly.
about
yeah.
people being able to nullify the law. I don't like this law. I'm not going to live by this law in our area.
Right.
And we thought we'd kind of settled the issue about you don't get to pick and choose which laws.
Right. Right.
And then Wisconsin proves, no, we're not doing this.
Yeah, we're
And
not.
we get away with it.
We did, yeah, and we were, the timing was such that even though the U.S. Supreme Court basically did overturn the Wisconsin decision, we were at that point into the Civil War, and it became a moot point, and
Right.
these guys were released and were able to live the rest of their lives. Another interesting part of this is that there's kind of a procedure where when a state Supreme Court files a decision, they have to send that paperwork up to the U.S. Supreme Court.
Oh, wow.
Wisconsin never did. And I believe to this day that they never did. So they remained defiant from 1850, whenever
Wow.
this decision came down until now. We basically said, nope, we're not even going to send this.
So they decided they
you,
were
to
not
the
going to
Supreme
bow
Court.
down.
No, we're not even going to let you consider whether or not you think this is constitutional. It's irrelevant to us, and this is how we're going to be. So it was
That
just
is
a
amazing to think
remarkable
that
defiance.
you just be a state for 6 years and decide,
Yeah.
like, no, we're not.
We have our principles. We have our
We
Constitution.
just got in the union.
Yeah.
And it's like, no, we're not doing this.
Yep. Yeah.
It
was
is an incredible thing. So
very
you
principled.
I think you mentioned obviously that you're about telling a good story and a story that needs to be told. But this has really been a labor of love, not just for you, but for your family. Your son's involved with this. I know I just met your daughter and your wife as well.
When you have a small operation, you kind of drag everybody in.
Mhm.
Now, my son makes sense. He's actually a video producer and has his own company in Madison. Does commercial video production, works for nonprofits, has done government stuff, weddings, the whole gamut.
Yeah.
He's got the drones license, so he can literally do just about everything.
Wow.
And then he has the team that he can pull together whenever we do a shoot that gives us a second or third cameraman, the lighting people, the sound people, and so
Okay.
on. So he's got a great team. And then for other events, I just kind of drag my poor daughter. She's 23 now. She lives nearby. So I just say,
Uh-huh.
hey, honey, we're doing an event. Would you be willing to come and sign people in or do whatever? And
Well,
she's,
and I know it to be true because I met her.
yeah,
So
and she's
I
a
know
great
you're doing
sport.
it.
Yeah, Nicole is.
And it was cold.
It was cold.
And
yeah,
she was out there making
I,
sure.
I owe her a month's supply of hot chocolate or
There
something.
we go. All right. Beautiful. So, talk about, what does it cost to do a full length documentary for Joshua Glover? What's that going to be?
Yeah, so we kind of have set a goal over a little over $500,000 to
Okay.
produce this. Obviously, you can spend a lot more than that to produce a film.
Yeah.
We're trying to do it on a pretty tight budget, but still at a very high professional level.
Yeah.
We want this to be. We're going to work with distributors. We want this to be on Netflix and on Prime, and we're going to pitch it to PBS and so on. So we want it to be of a caliber and a quality that even has a chance.
Right.
We're going to be working with professional narrators, and we're going to have animation, and we're going to have professional music. The music, even in the short version, the music is very powerful, and I think we're going to continue to add in the longer version even more music that I think is a lot of it's kind of undiscovered. There's actually an organization that finds old poetry, old songs, and brings them back to life.
Wow.
And so I found these folks, and I said, hey, you've got some powerful music here. Can we use some of those songs? But very few people have probably
Jermaine, can
heard
you
them.
imagine some of these folks finding some of these old Negro spirituals, some of these poems?
I'm blown away. I'm just sitting here listening to this, like, that's awesome, man. And if you ever need anything else, man,
Yeah.
I do movie scores as well.
Okay.
So,
There we
man,
go.
I would love to
Okay.
throw my name in the hat, man. But yeah, just to join the crew of those guys, man. But that's an excellent thing, man, that you're doing, man.
It's an
Yeah.
incredible thing because we're always talking about, how divided the country is,
Yeah,
white from black, from
Yeah.
Hispanic, all the other things that are going on.
yeah,
And to think that half a dozen years into being a state,
yeah. Just wow.
that 5,000 people would get together and be like, oh, no, this is not right. And to go pick up a beam in broad daylight,
Yeah,
smash in the courthouse
yeah.
and go get him.
And I never knew that story.
And the idea that they were hiding him for a month.
Wow, man.
And,
Thank
and,
you.
And I've talked to hundreds and hundreds of people about this story, and I can't believe, I would say maybe 1 or 2% have even heard the name Joshua Glover.
Yeah,
It's just
yeah.
amazing how this story has been lost.
I think a lot of us know about the mural.
Yeah.
Some of us know about the courthouse plaque, downtown. But each time I talk to you, I hear a new piece of this story I didn't know. And then to think, Jermaine's had to sit through some people who are maybe much more conservative,
Yeah,
who are, are coming to the station for the first time.
yeah.
And to think that the party, when we talk about Republican Party, the fact that, it starts in part because Joshua Glover,
Wow.
who's who becomes a freed slave, right?
Yeah.
An escaped slave, becomes a freeman because we freed him.
Yeah.
It's an amazing thing. And that the thought that these people are so pissed off about this that they decide they're going to create their own party.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the next presidential cycle, we end up with a Republican, brand new party. Abraham Lincoln gets in office.
Yeah.
And it's on. From there, right, we go right into Civil War. So he comes in, back in those days, it would have been March 4th or so he would have
March
come
of
in.
18, yeah.
By April, we're at war.
Yeah.
I mean, this is, I'm telling you.
Yeah.
So it's
Fort
an incredible
Sumter
thing.
takes place, Southern secession state by state, Civil War, and then eventually emancipation, and then eventually the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are all,
That
again,
make
those
us
dominoes.
free people forever in this
Yeah.
country at that point, and citizens of this country. So I know we got to go to a break, and we'll come right back after this.
the difference between me and
KWNOV
you?
family, we are back. You're listening to The Difference with Will Martin, and my guest is Michael Jahr, and we've been talking with this filmmaker, director, and producer. He's already done a 12-minute documentary on Joshua Glover that brings out a lot of these things that you might not know. In addition, I just was at a Civil War museum. By the way, how many people know that there's a Civil War museum in Delafield, Wisconsin, right? So once again, I get to go out, and he invited me to come and hear this presentation. They actually have the Civil War museum, including the flag that they used for Robert E. Lee to surrender. They have a piece of that there at the museum in Delafield. How, you'd never know.
It's in the basement of a building, but it's good. They've got this great Lincoln collection, Civil War collection. It's amazing.
Yeah, and so I got a chance to see the documentary there, and we're talking about an opportunity. So I'm talking with Michael and some folks to see if we can't, at the end of this month, have another opportunity for folks to be able to see that 12-minute documentary and then hear him talk about some of the history behind and what they've done. But you were saying before we went to break, this is a $500,000 endeavor to get this together. And I know I've already pledged to you. I'm gonna give you some money
Which I
to make
appreciate.
sure you get this documentary produced, because I want to see it.
I appreciate that so much too. And it's been the generosity of individuals and some corporations and who have helped us raise. We raised about $170,000 so far, which
And I
has
know
allowed
Governor
us.
Governor helping you.
Governor Walker,
Rebecca Clayfish has helped you as well.
Senator Johnson, Mayor Johnson. We just have we have people in Washington D.C. Robert Woodson of the Woodson Center, and others who have been just great supporters and backers of this. So if you want to see the film, you can go to our website. It's LAS.
No, I don't want them to see it there. They need to come out.
Right. Okay.
We're going to have a chance for them to come meet you.
Yeah.
And we will make sure there's food, because we know we don't hold nothing in this community without some food.
Well, it's a saying that there's no meeting without no eating.
Thank you. Thank you. So we will do it up the right way, but we're going to make sure that people can come and see it.
Yeah.
But now I do want to make sure that people do know about the website, because if they want to donate, I think there's so many times when we talk about our history being lost.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact is that you and your family are making sure that Black history is recognized as American history, and that it's not lost. And so that's why I was moved to want to make sure I give you something toward this effort. And I'm definitely going to start asking some other people to see if they will chip in too.
I appreciate that. We are working with some great scholars and academics, authors, to tell this story. And so go to our website. Don't watch the film.
Don't watch the film. Come and eat with us.
But it's lasfilm.com or lasfilm.org. LAS as in Liberty at Stake.film or film.com. You can make a donation there to the cause. There's a link right at the button right at the top. It's a nonprofit, so all your donations are tax deductible. We really can't tell this story unless people kind of come alongside and continue to help us. And we also want to distribute it widely once it is finished. So
that is so great. Michael Jahr, thank you so much for coming. And I know just before we go out of here, I want to make sure everybody knows to listen to this show, watch the show on YouTube and Facebook. On February 28th, we're going to talk about the hundreds of thousands of African-American soldiers who went south to fight for our freedom. So that'll be our story on February 28th for Black History Month. So until next week, peace out.